Pay close attention because what I am about to share with you will cause you to reconsider every interaction you have ever had with someone outside your age range, and it may already be unfolding in your life right now. Someone has developed deep feelings for you, but there is a gap between your ages that fundamentally alters everything you believe you understand about attraction and emotional bonding. I am a psychologist, and I need you to stay with me because this goes far beyond romance. It is about psychology, influence, and emotional exposure. Before we go further, I need you to like this video and subscribe because what you discover here may shield you from a decision you cannot undo. Now picture someone older or younger than you beginning to give you attention in a way that feels overwhelming, almost surreal, as though they perceive something within you that nobody else has ever recognized. Your mind does something extremely dangerous in response. It begins filling every gap with meaning. It tells you, this must be uncommon. This must be significant. This must be something written in the stars. But psychology reveals something entirely different about attraction across age gaps. It is not always rooted in love. It is frequently rooted in projection, novelty, and emotional needs that have gone unmet for far too long. And here is precisely where most people surrender their clarity. They confuse emotional intensity with genuine compatibility and confuse consistent attention with real commitment. If you have ever felt powerfully drawn towards someone significantly older or younger than you are not alone in that experience. But there is a deeper truth concealed within this dynamic that most people are never given the opportunity to hear. What registers as genuine connection can sometimes be emotional incompatibility disguised beneath layers of feeling. When someone older forms a bond with someone younger, there is frequently a psychological exchange occurring beneath the surface. One person is reaching for energy, freshness, or a sense of being valued, while the other may be reaching for direction, grounding, or simply sustained attention. And this imbalance generates a powerful emotional charge that mimics love, but is often chemistry constructed from contrast rather than true alignment. You may discover yourself thinking about this person continuously, replaying entire conversations in your mind, and interpreting every message as carrying far more significance than it actually holds. But your brain is not always delivering accurate information. It is attempting to organize emotional stimulation and novelty into something coherent. And when age difference enters the picture, dynamics of power frequently settle beneath the surface, quietly shaping your feelings without your awareness. So, before you decide this is destiny or convince yourself it is simply wrong, you need to genuinely understand what your emotions are actually responding to. You need to grasp something that most people are never taught about emotional attraction across age differences. When someone older develops feelings for someone younger, or the opposite occurs, your brain is not responding solely to the individual themselves. It is responding to what that individual represents in your emotional landscape. Psychologists refer to this as projection, and it stands among the most powerful distortions that exist within human connection. When you are younger, you may project safety, wisdom, or a sense of groundedness onto someone older, as though they have already discovered the solutions to everything life presents. You feel uncertain within your own world, and they appear settled, composed, and emotionally whole. But what you are perceiving is not always the actual reality before you. It is your own need for guidance being reflected directly back at you. And when you are older, the projection can transform into something entirely different: youth, aliveness, admiration, the sensation of being needed or emotionally restored. You may feel genuinely seen in a manner that life gradually stopped providing you years earlier. But here is the truth that consistently makes people deeply uncomfortable. Projection feels indistinguishable from chemistry because it produces intensity without any real foundation of stability. The mind fills every gap in emotional information with carefully constructed fantasy, and that fantasy becomes something emotionally addictive over time. You begin anticipating every message, reading excessive meaning into silence, and assigning weight to small gestures that were never intended to carry any significance at all. This is the precise moment where attachment begins forming, not from genuine mutual understanding, but from emotional anticipation that keeps your nervous system constantly activated. The greater the uncertainty within the dynamic, the more powerful the emotional pull becomes in response. And this explains why connections built across age differences can feel so completely all consuming. They activate both fascination and insecurity simultaneously within the same person. Your nervous system becomes acutely hyper aware of everything. Every interaction feels magnified, and your brain begins releasing dopamine in completely unpredictable rhythms, which produces a cycle bearing strong resemblance to emotional dependency. But what you are genuinely pursuing is not simply the person themselves. It is the sensation of being chosen by someone who feels categorically different from everything within your ordinary experience. And that sense of difference becomes mistaken for genuine emotional depth, when in reality, it is frequently nothing more than unfamiliar emotional territory being encountered for the first time. And unfamiliar does not always translate into healthy or right for you. And when you finally allow yourself to slow down sufficiently to observe your feelings without the layer of fantasy wrapped around them, you begin to perceive whether this connection is genuinely built on mutual understanding, emotional maturity, and a shared sense of direction, or simply on emotional contrast that registers as powerful but may ultimately fail to sustain real compatibility through the demands of actual life, leaving you with genuine clarity rather than ongoing confusion and a deeper sense of personal awareness and authentic self respect. There is a moment within every age gap connection where emotion stops feeling like something you are actively experiencing and begins feeling like something that is simply happening to you without your participation. And this transition is subtle but carries extraordinary importance because it marks precisely where emotional imbalance begins reshaping your perception without you ever detecting it. When someone significantly older or younger enters your emotional world, they do not arrive carrying only their personality. They carry their entire life experience, their accumulated expectations, and their unconscious behavioral patterns directly into every interaction. And your mind begins reorganizing itself around that presence in ways that feel like fascination, but are frequently a form of adaptation. Human beings naturally calibrate themselves in response to perceived authority or novelty in their environment. So, when the other person appears more experienced, your brain may unconsciously begin to defer to their perspective. When they appear more youthful or emotionally accessible, your brain may shift into a more protective or more deeply invested mode. And neither of these responses carries any real neutrality within them. They alter how you interpret everything from tone to silence to the smallest expressions of affection. One of the most consistently overlooked psychological forces operating here is the perception of power. Not necessarily actual power, but perceived emotional or social authority. You may begin feeling as though they understand something that remains beyond your current grasp, or that they are emotionally ahead or behind you in a way that generates genuine imbalance. And that imbalance can register as attraction because it activates your internal drive to either close the gap or help them close it themselves. This is precisely where emotional responsibility begins to lose its definition, because rather than two genuinely equal individuals relating to one another openly, you begin assuming roles: mentor, follower, protector, or student without ever consciously agreeing to inhabit those positions. And once roles solidify, feelings intensify considerably because roles introduce structure, and structure generates a sensation that closely resembles meaning. But meaning is not always equivalent to truth. Another dimension of this experience involves attachment activation. If your attachment style leans anxious, you may notice yourself growing increasingly preoccupied, more emotionally reactive, and far more sensitive to any shift in the other person's attention toward you. If your style leans more avoidant, you may experience a persistent push and pull where closeness feels simultaneously exciting and suffocating. And age difference amplifies every one of these existing patterns because it introduces profound uncertainty about your emotional and psychological standing within the connection. And uncertainty functions as powerful fuel for attachment formation, even when what is forming is not genuinely healthy attachment. So, what registers as deep and meaningful emotional bonding may actually be your nervous system working desperately to find stability within a dynamic it cannot fully comprehend or predict. And the genuine danger here is not the age difference existing between you, but rather the unexamined roles and unspoken emotional expectations that quietly form within it, steadily shaping how you love, how you respond to conflict, and how you gradually surrender your sense of emotional balance over time. At some point within these connections, there typically arrives a turning point where the emotional intensity becomes so familiar and constant that you entirely stop questioning it. And that is the precise moment when it becomes most powerfully influential over your decisions, because familiarity is fundamentally not the same thing as safety. Simply because something feels emotionally consistent does not confirm that it is genuinely stable beneath the surface. What occurs within age gap attraction is that emotional rhythm frequently becomes irregular, and your mind begins accepting unpredictability as its new normal and labeling that unpredictability as passion, when in reality, unpredictability ranks among the most potent drivers of emotional fixation known to psychology. The human brain is fundamentally wired to direct its attention toward what it cannot successfully anticipate. So, when someone delivers their attention in inconsistent waves, sometimes deeply and entirely present, sometimes withdrawn and unreachable, your nervous system begins elevating them within your emotional priorities without ever receiving your conscious authorization to do so. And you begin constructing elaborate meaning around their inconsistency itself. You convince yourself they are layered and misunderstood, or that they operate on a depth that others simply cannot access. But psychological research consistently demonstrates that inconsistency produces stronger attachment than consistency ever manages to create. And this is the threshold where emotional confusion begins masquerading convincingly as emotional depth. You are no longer simply responding to the person standing before you. You are responding to the neurological pattern they have established within your nervous system. And that pattern becomes genuinely addictive because it maintains your attention in a state of constant activation even during every moment of their physical absence. Another important dimension to examine here is the illusion of emotional acceleration that frequently appears within age gap dynamics. Things can progress far more rapidly than usual. Emotional disclosure arrives sooner, conversations reach deeper levels faster, attachment signals intensify quickly, and a sense of profound intimacy develops in compressed time. But speed is not automatically equivalent to depth. Sometimes, speed is simply two people projecting layers of meaning onto one another faster than they are genuinely building mutual understanding. Real emotional connection is not measured through intensity alone. It is measured through clarity, consistency, and shared emotional responsibility toward one another. But when age difference is present, those foundational elements can be unintentionally bypassed because both individuals may sense that something significant is occurring and rush to define it before they have actually developed sufficient understanding of what it truly is. So, what you experience as profound connection may in reality be accelerated emotional bonding that lacks any structural foundation beneath it. And across time, that absence of grounding begins revealing itself through persistent confusion, relentless overthinking, and cycles of emotional dependency, where you discover yourself continuously attempting to stabilize something that was never genuinely stable from the very beginning. And this is precisely the moment where self awareness becomes absolutely essential, because once you perceive the pattern with complete clarity, you cannot return to blindness, and you finally develop the capacity to distinguish emotional intensity from emotional truth. There is something that most people fundamentally misunderstand about age gap attraction, and it is this: the most powerful feelings are not always generated by similarity. Sometimes they are generated by contrast, and contrast carries extraordinary emotional magnetism because it directly challenges your internal assumptions about what genuine connection is supposed to feel like. When someone significantly older or younger enters your emotional space, they disrupt every familiar pattern you have developed for relating to others, and your mind immediately interprets that disruption as evidence of deep significance. But disruption is not interchangeable with compatibility. In truth, the brain frequently confuses emotional disruption with emotional importance because disruption triggers heightened attention and encodes memories with unusual intensity. So you recall the conversations with unusual vividness, the moments with extraordinary clarity, and the emotional peaks with far greater definition than you would retain from a more balanced connection. But what you are preserving in memory is not necessarily emotional truth. It is neurological activation masquerading as something deeper. And this is the threshold where people begin constructing entire personal narratives around someone based primarily on the strength of what they feel rather than the consistency with which they are actually treated. Another essential layer to comprehend is emotional asymmetry within age gap dynamics. One person frequently feels as though they are learning and discovering, while the other feels as though they are rediscovering something previously lost. And this generates an uneven emotional exchange, even when both individuals carry genuine interest in the connection. When one person feels as though they are being introduced to an entirely new emotional world, while the other feels as though they are being reminded of something they had forgotten or abandoned, the relationship begins organizing itself around fundamentally different psychological needs without either person becoming aware of this misalignment. You may feel deeply convinced that this person understands you in ways that others simply cannot. But sometimes what they understand is not truly you. It is the particular emotional version of you that fits neatly into their existing internal narrative of what meaningful connection is supposed to feel like. And that distinction is subtle yet absolutely critical because feeling genuinely understood registers as feeling genuinely loved, even when that understanding remains incomplete or shaped by selective perception. Over time, this pattern generates emotional dependency, not necessarily through any deliberate manipulation, but through the quiet operation of reinforcement cycles. Your brain begins associating this person with emotional awakening, a sense of validation, or the expansion of your own sense of identity. And that association strengthens every time emotional intensity is followed by relief or reconnection between you. But healthy emotional dawns are not constructed upon cycles of escalating intensity. They are constructed upon stability, mutual clarity, and emotionally consistent presence across time. And when those foundational elements are absent, your nervous system responds by escalating emotional investment as a way of compensating for the absence of predictability. And that compensation registers as deeper love when it is actually your brain working frantically to impose stability upon uncertainty through the mechanism of attachment. And the harder you work to make logical sense of the dynamic, the more emotionally entangled you inevitably become. Unless you develop the capacity to step back deliberately and evaluate what is genuinely being exchanged between you versus what is simply being felt within any given moment. Now I want you to sit with something that most people deliberately avoid contemplating because it strips away the fantasy entirely and returns responsibility directly to you. Within age gap attraction, there is always a fundamental question of timing. Not simply emotional timing, but timing as it relates to the actual trajectory of your life. And this is precisely where many of these connections encounter silent and invisible struggle. Even when feelings are entirely genuine, two people can care deeply and authentically for one another while remaining completely misaligned in terms of life direction, personal stability, priorities, or their respective stages of emotional development. When one individual is actively constructing their identity, professional foundation, or emotional independence, while the other exists within an entirely different phase of lived experience, the relationship begins accumulating invisible pressure that no quantity of chemistry can fully resolve. Your mind may resist this framework because it feels as though you are being invited to question something that genuinely matters to you. But questioning is not rejection of the connection, it is the cultivation of clarity. And clarity is ultimately what shields you from the prolonged confusion that emotional entanglement produces. What frequently unfolds across time within these dynamics is that both individuals begin unconsciously adjusting themselves in order to sustain the connection without fully recognizing the personal cost of those adjustments. You may find yourself quietly minimizing certain emotional needs, exaggerating others, or consciously dismissing discomfort because the emotional reward feels entirely worth the sacrifice. But adaptation is not automatically the same as genuine alignment. Sometimes you are not genuinely growing alongside one another. You are simply reorganizing yourselves around each other's presence. And that distinction carries considerable weight later because adaptation demands continuous effort, while genuine alignment feels fundamentally natural. Another significant psychological layer operating here involves future projection. When emotional investment runs deep, people instinctively begin imagining what the connection might eventually become, rather than evaluating what it actually is within the present moment. And age gap dynamics intensify this tendency considerably because the difference itself consistently invites the imagination to fill the spaces. You begin constructing detailed future scenarios, imagining conversations, significant milestones, and entire shared life trajectories. But those constructed visions are built upon emotional potential rather than present reality. And potential stands as one of the most emotionally persuasive illusions that human relationships produce, because it generates the sensation of already being halfway inside something even when you have not yet genuinely arrived there. And the more deeply you invest emotionally in what something could become, the more difficult it becomes to assess present day compatibility with any genuine objectivity. You may discover yourself rationalizing contradictions or minimizing legitimate concerns because your mind is actively working to protect the imagined future you have already developed a powerful attachment to. But genuine emotional maturity requires developing the capacity to separate what is felt from what is consistently demonstrated across extended time, not within isolated moments of extraordinary intensity, but within the sustained patterns of behavior and shared emotional responsibility that define how someone actually shows up in your life. And when you begin directing your attention toward patterns rather than isolated possibilities, you gain access to something genuinely valuable. The capacity to perceive whether this connection is actually constructing something with lasting stability or simply cycling repeatedly through emotional peaks that register as deeply meaningful but may ultimately fail to translate into sustainable and grounded connection within the actual circumstances of real life. At this point, I want you to receive something with complete clarity and without allowing emotion to distort it, because this is the precise threshold where awareness either liberates you or continues to hold you captive. Age gap attraction is not inherently wrong, and it is not inherently right. What carries genuine importance is not the numerical distance between your ages, but the emotional architecture existing within the connection itself, and whether both individuals are genuinely meeting one another as equals in terms of emotional responsibility, mutual respect, and honest clarity, or whether one person is silently carrying the greater portion of the emotional weight without fully recognizing that this is occurring. When feelings reach sufficient intensity, your mind will work consistently to justify the connection at all costs. It will generate narratives. It will amplify the finest moments and reduce the significance of the confusing ones because that is precisely what attachment is designed to do. It safeguards the bond, even when the bond itself is not genuinely stable. But you are not identical to your attachment response. You are the conscious observer of that response. And when you develop the practice of observing rather than immediately reacting, you progressively reclaim authority over how much influence any single person holds over your emotional state. One of the most essential questions you can present to yourself within any connection of significant intensity is not simply, how do I feel in this moment, but how do I consistently feel across extended time? Do I experience security or do I experience persistent uncertainty? Do I feel emotionally grounded or do I feel in a constant state of emotional activation? Do I experience genuine clarity or do I experience ongoing confusion? Because authentic clarity is rarely accompanied by chaos, and genuine confusion is rarely without meaningful cause. It typically points directly toward misalignment and timing, in underlying expectations, or in the actual emotional availability of the people involved. And when someone genuinely belongs within your life in a healthy and sustainable way, you will not find yourself perpetually decoding their behavior. You will feel understood without requiring yourself to overanalyze every single interaction as though searching for hidden meaning. Now, if you are currently navigating a situation that resembles what has been described here, I am not directing you to walk away from it or to remain within it. I am directing you to decelerate emotionally with sufficient intention to genuinely perceive what is actually occurring beneath the surface of the intensity, because intensity can generate a powerful sensation of meaning, but meaning itself is constructed through consistency, not through emotional peaks and valleys. And if this connection carries genuine substance, it will withstand your clarity without requiring you to suppress your instincts. It will not demand that you dismiss your legitimate needs or compromise your emotional stability simply to allow it to continue existing. And if it does carry those demands, then what you are experiencing, it will not demand that you dismiss your legitimate needs or compromise your emotional stability simply to allow it to continue existing. And if it does carry those demands, then what you are experiencing is not love in its most grounded and authentic form. It is emotional entanglement shaped by contrast, timing, and the distorting influence of psychological projection. And you deserve to hold that knowledge with certainty, because once you genuinely possess it, you will never again mistake the experience of chaos for the experience of true connection.